Hello everybody, welcome to the South East London Folklore Society. Nice to meet you all. We're going to crack on with the talk in a second. Debbie's going to give a talk about Annie Besant. She commissioned me a song, so I'm going to sing a song about Annie Besant as well later on. The talk's going to go on for, what is it, 3/4 of an hour to an hour, around about that. Then we'll have a tune. A little bit of a break for refreshment, and then an opportunity for Q&A. So, without further ado,
you're going to do your song first?
Do you want to do the song first?
Should we do the song first? Yeah,
okay.
I think that's okay with everyone.
Okay.
Many songs have been inspired about Annie Besant, so this would be, or poems back in the old days, so this would be interesting to hear an actual song.
Teacher, Harry of Arto, I saw a good mother transcending the world. Thought force, freedom carries new love across the universe. She knows what the secret chiefs know. She knows where the secret chiefs go. Fruits of philosophy, servant of destiny, a calm, a cold, transcending the world.
George, that was brilliant. Well, so we're here tonight to talk about Annie Besant, her faults and forms. And the reason I titled it this talk was because, well, Annie had a lot of faults, and she had a lot of different forms, which we'll come to later. And she evolved into many different forms as we went along. So, this is her astrological chart. Annie was born Annie Wood on the 1st of October in 1847 in London. When she was a small child, she had an accident where she banged her head on the canopy of her cradle, and she was left with a scar and a slight paralysis in the muscles of one side of her forehead. Annie grew up believing in ghosts, fairies and the little folk, her mother telling her tales of banshees howling in Ireland when a relative was about to die. And Annie learnt to read quickly and spent most of her childhood with her head in a book, mainly fantasy tales. Sadly, her father died when she was just 5 years old, which had a bit of an effect on her. In fact, it was such a shock on her and her mother that both of their hairs turned white overnight. So this is Annie with her mother. As a young girl, she was taught Christianity, which she practiced piously. She studied Christian history and admired the missionaries and the Daniel figures that were flung to the lions by those that have persecuted the Christian faith. So Annie got involved with Christianity from a very, very early age. She even believed that she was going to meet Jesus and marry him. Annie began to daydream of preaching to crowds the good news and then becoming a martyr for the cause. She was educated under the tutelage of Miss Marriott, who gave her an education in music, languages and grammar, as well as taking Annie on trips to Europe to study not just culture but philosophy and religion. Annie became so devoted to her faith that she did not want to marry a man. Only Christ himself was suitable to her as a suitor. So this is young Annie with the Bible, apparently. She studied all that had been written on Christianity, from the Christian fathers to Augustine to modern-day theologians. She was particularly interested in the mysteries of Christ. She was so dedicated she would fast for her Lord, go into ecstatic meditations, and even tried self-flagellation, which apparently she realised wasn't the way to go. She said passionate prayers to Christ, calling him her heavenly bridegroom. She wanted to prove herself and her belief to her God. This is the Reverend Frank Besant. Annie met the Reverend Frank Besant in 1866. He would come and visit her and her family when they stayed at St Leonard's, and it was there that he proposed when she was just a young lady. There seems to have been some misunderstanding between the two of them, as Annie did not give the Reverend an immediate answer. In fact, she said nothing, and he took her silence as a yes. Annie had probably envisioned a life of asceticism, full of devotion to her Lord. Maybe the idea of becoming a nun entertained her, but this was not to be. She was married to Frank Besant in 1867 and bore him 2 children, a daughter and a son. So this is Annie with her son on the left and her daughter Mabel on the right. Annie gave birth to her son Digby in January 1869. It had been a difficult pregnancy for her, and then in 1870 she found herself pregnant again. Her second child was a girl, Mabel. Both pregnancies and both births made Annie very weak. The physical strain was too much for her. Her daughter, Mabel, was a sickly baby, bringing more worry to Annie and leading her to question her belief in a good, kind God. Why would her loving Lord allow this suffering to happen to her and her children? Annie was not prepared for marriage, and in those days you weren't really told about what was going to happen when you got married, and she was quite shocked on her wedding night as to how children come about. She'd always been a free spirit and wanted to continue that way. Her new husband thought otherwise. And this is a quote from Annie. "My dreamy life, into which no knowledge of evil had been allowed to penetrate, in which I'd been guarded from all pain, shielded from all anxiety, kept innocent on all questions of sex, was no preparation for married existence, and left me defenceless to face a rude awakening." And he wrote this in her biography some years later. So as I was saying, she was shocked at what happened on her first night of marriage, as she had not been told anything about a wife's expected duties. This is Annie after she was married. Frank and Annie argued a lot, disagreeing on most matters, from house chores to the upbringing of their children. It wasn't long before Annie realised what an unsatisfactory wife she was, and the marriage with the Reverend was not how she had imagined it to be. Annie wrote some fiction which she had published, and when the cheque came for the work, she was informed that any money she earned was to be given to her husband, as he was her designated owner. This was another shock for her. Her independence was no longer there. She was to rely on her husband for everything. Annie became unhappy as her faith was tested and her marriage faltered. She began to rethink her devotion to both the Lord and her husband. She was ready to rebel against both. Annie had a bit of a crisis of faith during her early years of marriage. She began to read about other religions and saw that there was a lot of comparison between them all, and that Christianity was not as unique as it made out. And it was at this time as you've heard, that she decided that she didn't really want to marry Christ either, and that marriage wasn't good for her in any way whatsoever. So Annie was getting a bit fed up with the constant arguing with her husband, which was by now becoming violent. He was fed up with her independent streak, and soon they realised they were living separate lives. And as you can see there, she looks quite sturdy and independent. He had his religious duties as a reverend, and she had her motherly duties to her children, as well as her own struggles with her faith. In fact, she was losing her faith. Her belief in a loving God and in Jesus as Christ was dwindling and about to take a 180-degree turn. She was becoming a non-believer, an atheist. Later, her political campaigns for the working peoples, which we will come to, would become a problem for her husband. And also she wrote a pamphlet querying the divinity of Christ, which didn't go down too well with Reverend Besant either. The Manchester Martyrs was the first instance of the justice system Annie was to encounter. 2 Irish men were arrested in Manchester for raising funds for the Irish Army and inciting rebellion against the British. Annie attended the trial and watched the men be found guilty and sentenced to death. This began Annie's zeal for liberty for one and all, and she became a reformer for a better justice system, a better world, and a better life for so many people, which again caused arguments with her and her husband because he believed the legal system is set up by Christianity and it should be followed, and that if someone does something bad, they should be punished. This is Charles Bradlaugh. Annie found a partner in this man. This was her new mission. He was a reformer and a crusader who saw, when he met Annie, a sister fighting for the cause. Together they became firm friends and supporters to each other as they rallied support for their political beliefs and radical manifestos. It was a platonic relationship, but scandal makers liked to whisper that it was something more. And Bradlaugh's daughter said that they did in a way fall in love, but because they both respected that they were previously married, neither of them carried on that love. They respected each other. And this here is a sculpture by Susie Sammett of Charles Bradlaugh. Annie had written some pamphlets questioning Christianity and comparing the Gospels. She pulled apart the theology and the philosophy of the Old and the New Testament, and she saw no limit in religious thought, which again caused problems with her and her husband Frank, who of course was strict to the Bible. She still attended church and often played organ for the congregation. One day, whilst practicing in the empty church, she suddenly found herself wondering about what it would be like to give a sermon. She looked at the pulpit as words came to her head. She walked over and stood behind it. Then she began to give an inspired sermon to her imaginary congregation. But this experience made her realise that she could give speeches, deliver sermons, and speak on the rights of every man, woman and child if given a public platform. So this is the National Reformer, which Charles Bradlaugh started, the newspaper. It was around this time that Annie and Frank separated, and Frank took their son and raised him while Annie raised Maud, their daughter. In the summertime, the children would swap their parents, Digby coming to be his mother, Maud to be with her father. In 1874, Annie joined the National Secular Society, so she's broken away from her Christian beliefs and fallen for the secular way of thinking. And it was here that she actually met Charles Bradlaugh, who was the founder of that society as well as this paper. Charles was so impressed with Annie's writings and her thoughts on atheism, something Annie had been thinking about for some time. Her faith in a deity of any kind had been rocked by the failure of her marriage and the hardships of everyday living, not just for herself but for everybody. And Bradlaugh offered Annie a job on this paper he produced, the National Reformer, where she wrote articles and reviews, sometimes using the pseudonym Ajax, not after the Greek god, but after a statue cast that was in Crystal Palace titled Ajax Crying for Life, something she very much related to. I tried to find a picture of that, but there doesn't seem to be any available. So this is one of her pamphlets, The Law of Population and Its Consequences. which was to do with that there was too many people in the country and too many people are having children and there was no contraception allowed. So both Annie and Charles Bradlaugh campaigned for people with non-religious beliefs and for social reform. In 1877, the pair were accused of producing obscene libel pamphlets, the subject being about contraception and family planning, which was widely condemned by the establishment. Annie was by now vice president of the Secular Society and gave many speeches to their growing numbers, and she was very popular. Many people came to listen to Annie speak. Annie and Charles would travel the country together, giving speeches on equality, liberalism, politics and religion. They gathered many followers and their meetings were full and often overflowing with supporters. And it was around this time that Frank was trying to take both her children away from her. Divorce he wouldn't apply for, and she did try to apply for divorce, but because she was the woman, it wasn't going to be allowed. Annie put up a tremendous fight to get her daughter back and did win, but there was much debate as to whether an atheist, which she was now admitting she was, should be a guardian to a child, and it was that went against her to keep her son. Annie had always loved music and songs, and was an accomplished pianist herself. It was around this time that Annie had published her songbook, and she had also worked on the Freethinkers textbook, which was causing a stir amongst the establishment. So it was at this time that she was beginning to get a name anyway for being a free thinker and sticking up for people's rights, which again was unusual for a woman to be doing. The songbook she created was full of hymns and songs, all with a secular theme, and was popular amongst the movement. And these songs were often sung at meetings. So this is Annie and Charles. But the meetings did not always go smoothly. There were many protests against the Secular Society, and some of them turned violent. Hecklers began to intrude on meetings, and at some talks Annie gave, there was a stone throwing. Once, while Charles was giving his speech, a stone was actually thrown. It hit Annie on the back of her head. Another time she received a cut to the eye. She attempted to leave a meeting with her friends. So people were turning violent against her, those that were not up for her opinions. The York Herald gave a review about their talks that read, "The audiences are to be entertained with a lecture and a battle on the same night." There's a close-up of Annie. Annie's other writings of this time included The Gospel of Atheism, The Fruits of Philosophy, The Law of Population, subjects that were very different from the days when she'd written on Christ, Jesus and the Christian faith, a faith that she had so adored, she had wanted to be married to it. Is that Annie coming through? So many people disagreed with Annie's publications and speeches on birth control, yet they were also some of her most popular pamphlets. But this kind of thing also attracted the disapproval of the establishment, and once again she found herself in trouble with the law. Again, it was regarded as obscene libel. She and Charles argued for the right of free speech and suddenly found themselves being spied on by private detectives. And some of the private detectives came in disguise to their matings or to buy the books and pamphlets published by the society so that they could then use them in the court case against them. And this pamphlet that they'd released, it wasn't just about contraception, it was also about, people should be allowed to be free thinking and shouldn't have to go to church, and that there should be more freedom for everyone. So this is one of the sketches from the newspaper of the day. The pair were arrested, this is Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant, were arrested for producing obscene pamphlets, which mainly consisted of writings on family contraception, free thinking, as well as how to control the country's population, which was growing at a phenomenal rate. These subjects were deemed dangerous in these days, and that they could cite a riot, which was happening at most of their talks. They sat through a number of trials, but Bradlaugh, being a master at argument and law as well as being a gentleman, at the same time won over the jury as he asked them to look into the real meaning of the word obscene and whether it related to the publications he and the Secular Society produced. Their case took the interest of the newspapers, which also brought them many new supporters as the trial became a national sensation. Annie and Charles defended themselves, and this included them having to explain their beliefs in social justice, social living. The trial actually went on for quite a few weeks, and when finally all the evidence was given, the jury did not take long to come to a verdict. At first they announced them guilty and wanted them to have 6 months imprisonment and a £200 fine each. And I was trying to read through the papers about this. I don't quite understand how this happened, but instead they didn't go to prison. They paid a £500 fine each and had a retrial, and at the retrial all the charges were squashed. So, but I'm not a legal head, so I don't understand. But during that retrial, they announced the following statement when giving their judgment. This is the jury. We are unanimously of opinion that the book is calculated to deprave public morals, but at the same time, we entirely exonerate the defendants from any corrupt motive in publishing it. So they were both acquitted. These trials would have a personal impact on Annie's life. Her estranged husband decided that she was not fit to be a mother, blaming her atheistic ways and the company she kept as being unfit for rearing Mabel, her daughter. Annie was distraught when Mabel was put into her father's care, and she put together a legal team to help win her daughter back. Frank Besant told the courts that Annie had deprived her daughter of religious instruction, which in those days was considered anathema. Annie lost the case and her children. She was allowed to visit them once a month, but she and her daughter Mabel found it too distressing, and soon the visits became less frequent. So she just wanted to be a good mother, and her husband wouldn't let her. So this is again from the newspapers, the different scenes from the trial. And these are from the Fabian Society, which Annie next joined, because after losing her daughter, she just threw herself into her political work. She joined the Fabian Society, which was a new group set out to bring socialism to Britain. It was here that she began a close relationship with George Bernard Shaw, and there's rumours that they had an affair, but who knows. He was a bit of a lad, wasn't he? So he had affairs with everyone. Annie also put herself through university, which again was unusual at that time. Not many women went to university. She studied at South Kensington such topics as science, mathematics, botany, inorganic chemistry, magnetism and electricity, as well as advanced physiology. She was a first-class student and passed with flying colours, going on to teach these subjects to other students in the Hall of Science courses. Not many colleges would admit women to their classes, let alone let them teach back in those days. Annie did come up against a lot of opposition from college councils who disapproved of her studies and her political views. On that, you probably can't quite see it, but Annie's name's on there because she's about to give a talk for that actual meeting. This is W.T. Stead, or Stead as some people say. I think maybe you should get someone to do a talk on him one day, George, because he's a fascinating character in himself. One of Annie's good friends was W.T. Stead, who also worked for social reform. Together they had worked for the Law and Liberty League, whose members also included William Morris. On November the 13th, 1887, they were involved in the Bloody Sunday riots. Annie had helped organise a march in London that was protesting for employment rights for the people, as well as against Britain's treatment of Ireland. Various social groups gathered together at Trafalgar Square to protest, and these included the Fabian group and social reform groups, and it was reported there were 30,000 protesters. It is unclear how the riot began, but the police were deployed to halt the rally, and soon this turned into horrific fighting, and it became known as Bloody Sunday in Trafalgar Square. Many were arrested. Annie was heavily involved in the match girls' strike of 1888. She now worked on a new petition, better salary and working conditions for these match girls and other women in factories. Factories across the country, many women worked long hours for poor pay. She had the support of Herbert Burrows, and together they formed the Matchmakers' Union, which Annie was Honourable Secretary of. She helped organise strikes amongst the working women, which were usually quickly settled when terms were agreed, and Annie was very good at sorting out terms for people, and She was a good debater as well and was able to put across people's arguments very well. All this led to other working staff of factories across the country demanding better pay and working conditions, and soon what had been known as sweatshops, factories with unsuitable working conditions and pay. These sweatshops had to change the way they operated for the good of its staff. And this worked. Annie's petitions and leadership of the strikes got them noticed as she set up unions for workers from all walks of life, and soon laws were being made that gave better rights to these workers. We've got the blue plaque there for her work as part of the match strike. Annie found a new friend as well called James Williams Ashman, an engineer for the Great Western Railway, who had also followed a Christian spiritual path but was dissatisfied with the church and its teaching. He preferred a more psychic and esoteric approach. He met Annie and began to teach her to develop her own spiritual powers, including telepathy, and it was he who had introduced her to Theosophists who knew Madame Blavatsky. And this is where Annie now changes her whole view on everything, from being an atheist, from being a Christian, then changes to an atheist, and then she goes back into spirituality. In the mid-1880s, whilst Annie was working on the National Reformer and Free Thought papers, she was made aware of the fact that many of the members of the National Secular Society had joined a new society, the Theosophical Society, which was founded by Helena Blavatsky. And this is Helena. Annie decided to look into it to find out why it attracted so many National Secular Society members. At first, she wanted to try and find out how to put it down. She didn't agree with it at all. But Bradlaugh told her not to be too concerned, as he had met one of its founders, a Henry Steele Alcott, when he was visiting America, and thought him a decent chap. So when the Theosophy Society started, there was actually 3 founders: Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Henry Steele Alcott, and William Quan Judge. And it was founded in 1875 in New York. The aim of the society being to study the unexplained and to start a new brotherhood for humanity that would unite men, women and children of all faiths and nationalities. It's now based in India and had much influence among the Indian peoples and on Indian members of the National Secular Society. At first, Annie and the president of the Theosophical Society, Madame Blavatsky, clashed in magazine columns. Annie was concerned as to why free thinkers were being taken in by this mystical group, whereas Helena Blavatsky defended her society with flattery and kind remarks, reminding her that Annie herself had often been the victim of blind bigotry, and that she should perhaps research the society before she made judgment upon them. And Annie quite respected Madame Blavatsky's words and did look further into it. She took out all the books that she could find on theosophy and started reading, and it turned her. So this is Annie with 2 of the founders. We've got Henry Steele Alcott sitting down and William Quan Judge. Madame Blavatsky had started the Theosophy Society under the instruction of 2 Mahatmas, known as Master Kuthumi and Master Moya. These 2 Mahatmas would write letters to certain members of the Theosophical Society, giving them instructions and advice on the running of the society. In some of these letters, Annie Besant was named, as well as Charles Bradlaugh, instructing the society to stay in good relations with both of them. One of the letters, which was sent to a theosophist named A.P. Synod, asked him to show Annie one of the Mahatma letters. And these Mahatma letters, they weren't written with pen or pencil, they were what they call precipitated. So the Mahatma would send the letter to either Blavatsky or William Quan Judge or any of the other leading theosophists, and they would either be able to write it themselves, hear it and write it for them, or they would just appear on paper in front of them. And the ink, you can see them in the British Library. They're not ink on top of the paper, the ink's in the paper. It's very strange how it's been done, mystical. In fact, now most of these letters were not delivered by usual post, they were precipitated. They just arrived as if out of the air. The recipients would find these letters waiting for them, perhaps at a desk, writing in coloured pencil. Yet on closer inspection, these inks were not on the paper but in it, and it is like crayon. One of the masters writes in blue and the other one writes in red. As Annie investigated this society, she soon found herself becoming more and more interested with its beliefs and philosophies. Her friend W.T. Stead had given her copies of The Secret Doctrine, a giant book written in 2 parts by Madame Blavatsky. The first book dealt with cosmology and the evolution of the universe. The second book was about humanity and its history. Annie found it fascinating reading and went off to meet the author, Madame Blavatsky. She found herself drawn to her, and Annie Besant had found a new cause, Theosophy. And Theosophy is known as the ancient wisdom. And Annie Besant wrote a book called The Ancient Wisdom as well. Annie wrote an article that was to shock many of her close friends, especially the political ones. The paper was titled, "Why I Became a Theosophist." This took many of her socialist friends by surprise. Annie had done, again, a 180-degree turn, going from being a non-believing atheist to becoming a new thinker in theosophical beliefs. Her studies in theosophy taught her many things, such as discovering that she'd had many past lives, and in 2 of them she knew her identity, Giordano Bruno and Hypatia, the librarian at the Library of Alexandria. So, she'd been 2 quite prominent figures in a past life. Annie had to rethink many of her beliefs. During her political campaigns, she had fought for the right for women to have abortions. Now her theosophical beliefs were to teach her a different view. All life was sacred, each newborn life being a reincarnated soul who has come back to this world to live a new life. Abortion to her was now forbidden. Annie's friendship with Helena Blavatsky grew strong, and when Blavatsky was stuck for somewhere to live, Annie offered her her house. She became Madame Blavatsky's secretary and helped run the society. She received letters from the Mahatmas advising her on her duties. So this is Annie Besant with Alcott on the left, and this is C.W. Ledbetter on the right, who's a bit of a suspicious character. But as you might have noticed through all this, everything she does, she always seems to link up with a man. Always works in partnership with a man. Bradlaugh, W.T. Stead, and this, in Theosophy, her partner became Ledbetter. Now, if one reads Annie Besant's biography of this time, she discusses how during her political years she'd been quite dissatisfied with her own teaching in atheism. It is as if there was a niggling doubt to her disbelief, to her atheistic cause. She couldn't quite commit herself, though she would never have admitted this to Bradlaugh or George Bernard Shaw. And if you read her papers on atheism, you wouldn't think that she'd had any doubt, because she's quite prominent in atheism is the way to go. She knew deep down that she'd always believed in something, whether it was a god, a divine spirit, whatever it was, it stopped her totally losing her faith. Her faith just could not be wiped out. Annie had always felt a presence around her which she believed was some kind of divine connection, and she admits later that when she was given a copy of Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, she heard a disembodied voice asking her, "Are you willing to give up everything for the sake of truth?" The voice had such a power behind it that she knew it was from the higher realms, and she immediately replied, "Yes, Lord." Annie's theosophical studies immediately took her back into belief of the supernatural, and she began to write articles for the Theosophical magazines, and she later went on to be the editor for them. Again, like before, when she was doing her political rants with the National Reformer, she became the sub-editor, the secretary, and now she's got into Theosophy. She's managed to get quite high up in the publication of all their papers and magazines. And this is the book she wrote, Thought Forms, with Charles Ledbetter. Together they worked on telepathy and all the different psychic phenomena that was going on at that time. So there seems to be a pattern to all of Annie's causes. She throws herself in with full belief and writes articles for the relevant literature. She takes the platform to give right speeches to further the cause. She ends up being the editor to the relevant magazine or paper, and soon ends up being a part of the leadership and help in running the society. And in each society she seems to gain a male friend with whom she has a particularly close relationship. In Theosophy, that man was Reverend Charles W. Ledbetter. The two of them became the leading lights of the Theosophical Society after Madame Blavatsky's death. With Leadbeater, she was to write many books on esoteric and theosophical works, as well as lead the society. The pair continued their theosophical studies and researched the esoteric together, and they were both very interested in clairvoyance and wrote many articles on this as well as books on other esoteric subjects. One of their most popular books is Thought Forms, a study on the effects of one's thoughts on beings. They regarded thoughts as vibrations, just as everything in the universe is vibrating energy that at certain frequencies becomes solid matter. Annie and Leadbetter researched how one's thoughts can affect other things, people, etc. A good thought sends good vibes and can be felt by the receiving party. A bad thought sends negative vibes and again can be felt by the receiving party. Yet most of the time, we all go about oblivious to what we send or receive of our thoughts and that of others. And this is what they were trying to teach people, to think nice thoughts and to be positive. But they also wanted to bring a world teacher. Annie continued to live in India at the Theosophical headquarters in Adyar. It was not long after Madame Blavatsky's death that Annie actually became president of the Theosophical Society. With her colleague Charles Leadbetter in the year 1909, she began a new project to find a world teacher. This world teacher would unite the people and the religions of the world with the Theosophical teachings and start a new, peaceful world order. The new world teacher they wanted was discovered in Adyar. A young Indian lad called Jiddu, whom Besant and Leadbetter decided would be ideal as the vehicle for this role of world teacher. At the time, he was 14 years old, and he and his brother Nitya were taken under the wing of the Theosophical Society, and young Jiddu was trained to become the world teacher. With this role, he was given a new name, Krishnamurti. Annie actually adopted him as her own son, which Jiddu's father had agreed with, though in later years he was to say he did regret this decision. Annie and Krishnamurti had a close relationship, he regarding her as a surrogate mother, his own birth mother having died when he was 10 years old. And for Annie, it was probably, she'd lost her own children, though they would have been older by this time. It was probably the son that she never got to bring up herself. So this is Annie and the young Krishnamurti. Oh no, this is Krishnamurti here, this is his brother. Krishnamurti was willing to become this world teacher, even though he found some of the training very hard, painful even, as he worked on his spiritual awakening, so that he could become the perfect world teacher. In this role, Krishnamurti would be the vehicle that would allow the Christ energy and the Buddhic of the Lord Maitreya, the last Buddha to come to this planet, to come to him. Their energy was to come through him and pass on their wisdom to the world, making him the world's greatest spiritual teacher. Together with Annie, a new society called the Order of the Star in the East was created to promote his work and the World Teacher Project. He travelled the world giving lectures as well as writing books on spiritual awakening and the purpose of the order. That's Annie, she was getting older, and Krishnamurti is a young man taking on his role as the world teacher. And this is him with Leadbetter and his young brother at the front. But over the years, some of this mystical training that Krishnamurti had to go through began to make him, Krishnamurti, see his role quite differently to how Annie saw it. Sadly, his brother died, and the death of his brother, who had been by his side throughout his life, he took badly and made him question a lot of the work he was doing. 20 years after being chosen to be the world teacher, in 1929, Krishnamurti, disenchanted with himself and the Order of the Star of the East, renounced his role as the world teacher and had the order disbanded. This caused some problems for the Theosophical Society. Their project seemed to have failed, and Annie, as president, was seen by many as responsible. She was accused of neglecting the roots of Theosophy for her belief in her world teacher and in the World Teacher Project. Annie defended herself, and her proclamations of heralding a new teacher in Krishnamurti, but many Theosophists were angry that she had concentrated on her protégé rather than the Mahatmas who had asked Madame Blavatsky to start the Theosophical Society. And it was at this time that Annie was saying she was getting letters from the Mahatmas, but many of the Theosophists thought they were fake ones. Krishnamurti makes his break from the Theosophical Society, leaving Leadbeater and Besant in India. So Annie had to find a new project. She continued her Theosophical studies, but she still had a political head on and was soon involved in the Indian national movement and helped the Indians rise up against the British in a peaceful-ish revolution and thus bring about India's independence. As a member of the Indian National Congress and also as editor of one of the leading newspapers in India, again she's got in with the papers, which was called the New India, Annie campaigned for Home Rule. Annie was seen as a threat by the British who were ruling India, and she was actually arrested and jailed for her campaigning. But she was so popular amongst the Indians and the Muslims of this country that they protested, and a riot almost ensued. And so because of this, she was released and helped lead the country to freedom from British rule. And that was part of her, one of the last things she did was this Theosophical Order of Service, because Annie actually died in India on the 20th of September 1933. And she was cremated. The Theosophists were the first people to bring cremation to Europe, and that's how, instead of being buried, they would be cremated. So she was cremated out in India, but just before she did this, she started the Theosophical Order of Service. This is an order that still runs today for Theosophical members to organise themselves for various lines of service. That's its motto. And its other motto is towards a union of those who live in the service of all that suffers, and also a union of those who love in the service of all that suffers. It's got many aims and still runs today. Here we go. So this is some of the many things it deals with. One of its projects was to knit teddy bears for refugee children, which was seen as a comfort, because all these poor children that had no parents were just trying to travel across the land. And they realised that just by giving them a little teddy to cuddle, helped them deal with what was happening to them much better. It's a psychological thing more. So this is an organisation that tries to get involved with humanities work worldwide. It deals with animals, it tries to get drinking water for everyone. It has an educational system for people in India, and very big on dance and music, because they feel music, again, is vibration, dancing is vibration, and that's all part of the Theosophical cause. So this is Annie Besant in her last years, wearing her, well, whether it's a Masonic uniform, I'm not sure. And this is Annie Besant's little shoes, which I got to put on. And many people said Annie Besant was a tall woman, but they fitted me. So I'm pretty sure a tall woman wouldn't have little tiny feet like her. And this is her handprint. She went and met Chiro, who was one of the famous palmists of the day. And if anyone could get a copy of that and is interested in that kind of thing, her palm is quite interesting with all the stars and crosses it has on it. She was, even from birth, meant to do great things, and her astrology chart says that as well. So I brought with me, if anyone wants them, some esotericas which tell you a bit more about the Theosophical Order of Society, as well as a bit more about Theosophy, because they do try to do some wonderful things for humanity. So thank you.